Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. My guest today has written a book that should make every honest person a little uncomfortable, not because it's provocative for its own sake, but just because it forces a reckoning with a history most of our major institutions have worked very hard to ignore. National Review's Noah Rothman's new book, Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America, makes a straightforward but explosive argument that contrary to the common refrain, political violence in this country has also been a project of the left, and that its history not only stretches back over decades and decades, but that the intellectual ecosystem that excuses it is still very much alive and operating today. This isn't a book about whataboutism. It recognizes that the right is violent, for sure. It's about what actually happens. I learned really a ton of things and what is still happening. Noah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Vero.
So it's great to have you. I really enjoyed the book. Again, it's called Blood and Progress, A Century of Left-Wing Violence in America. This is your third book, I believe, right?
It is. Yes.
The first time actually, the first book I read by you was the one about how the left has no sense of humor, which I thought was actually a very fun book. And Unjust was also a great book. Am I forgetting anything else?
No, that's it. Except for yes.
Yeah. So that's your third book. So let me kind of tell you what I got out of your book, and then we can go into the details and tell me if I forgot anything. So the first point I think that you make is really that there is a tendency for the public, the media, politicians, pretty much everyone to overlook left-wing violence, even though actually left-wing violence is real. It's been going on for a long time. There's been, you describe in your book, 3 large waves of left-wing violence, including one in which we are now, right? So that's like the first one. It's overlooked. But the other thing is, like, even when it is acknowledged that there's left-wing violence, it's excused in a way. People say that it's regrettable and it is sad and violence should never be accepted, but there's always the but think about what people are going through in a way. And one of the kind of the thing that follows the but very often is the fact that it's justified because of right-wing violence.
I think that's totally down the line and astute. There's this phenomenon that we all encounter, I think, on social media, where the argument is it's not happening. And also, it's understandable that it's happening, or maybe even good that it's happening, depending on the audience that you're talking to, right? So there's that but. We heard that but after the assassination by the alleged murderer of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, Luigi Mangione, where you had Democratic officials, really prominent members of the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, all of them condemning the murder, but then appending that very pregnant but onto the condemnation, which renders everything that came before dismissible and perfunctory. And after that, they say, yeah, you have to understand that the healthcare system is broken, and everybody's so angry. In Bernie Sanders' case, it was not just that the healthcare system is broken, but the education system is broken, the finance system is broken, the housing system is broken, the election system is broken. It is broken. The country is broken. And what it needs as a remedy is a holistic revolutionary change. And that's where the attraction to violence comes in, because for the activist class, particularly on the left, the issue is never the issue, as David Horowitz said, paraphrasing an SDS radical. The issue is the revolution. And so that's the but. And the other thing is the dismissing it. And in our age, that comes in the form of reminders that the American right is the font from which domestic violence springs. Anything that happens on the left is an outlier, regrettable, as you say, but not indicative of broader trends. And there is a whole host of databases that are deployed to justify this claim. And people are only familiar with the top lines of those databases, which purport to contend that the American right is uniquely violent, uniquely murderous. If you get down into the details of those data sets, you see a lot of stuff that people don't think of when they think of political violence, gang violence, prison violence, intrafamily violence. Somebody spray paints the side of a church with graffiti and slurs. That's right-wing violence. A homeless man wanders into a hotel and starts hurling at racial epithets at the hotelier, assaults him. Right-wing violence. That's not what people think of, and it's much like those databases that gun groups like Everytown promote, where they say, there've been like 70 school shootings this year, and you say, I don't recall 70 school shootings, and what they mean is that somebody discharged a firearm adjacent to a school property, and that's how you abuse data in this way to retail a political claim. And lastly, there is the smoking gun, in my view, that I describe in chapter 1, which is this report that was authored for the Department of Homeland Security in 2021, in which the researchers contend that the study of left-wing violent extremism is shot through with two problems. One, the fact that people who are indeed participants in these movements are sometimes tasked with the study of them, rendering the whole enterprise fatally subjective. And two, that people who do engage in this work face intimidation campaigns from their colleagues, social isolation, even the threat of physical retaliation for merely studying this subject. All of this should combine to convince the skeptical reader, or at least somebody who's open to the premise that I'm articulating here, that this whole field needs a rethink. And indeed, just confronting the evidence of your own eyes, a successful or attempted assassination of a right-wing figure, and an armed assault in an ICE or CBP facility, the riots that descend almost nightly in places like Portland, Oregon. And then we hear, oh, but it's the right. You got to just focus on the right. Don't worry about the left. That that has the quality of excuse making after a while, just giving you license to look away and not confront the problem. Meanwhile, the problem has become metastatic. I hope that Blood and Progress convinces the fair minded reader to reevaluate where the threat is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I was stunned actually, like when you talk about the Cincinnati University Center, right? Or that
Yeah,
collection of data. I was thinking first, where does it's in a university? Which department is it in? That
I have to look up the
yeah,
manuscript because I
but
forget what it's a project associated with the university.
yeah, yeah. Okay. So I mean, but I was just like, I was shocked by what you were talking about. First, like saying that the violence had peaked in 2019, which is kind of like, even if you're willing to believe, like everything they say, like if you've got lived through the last 7 years or so, you know that there's been actually a lot of violence. And in fact, I think everyone, even not paying a lot of attention, kind of have the feeling that we are in one of these waves, definitely one of these modern waves, kind of resembling like the 70s. And after reading your book, I know that the 1910s and 20s were also extremely violent.
Extremely violent, and our age would be much more violent for want of certain instruments. I think in the absence of the 9/11 attacks, we would be experiencing a lot more bombings than we're experiencing right now. That was the instrument of choice for the domestic left-wing terrorist in the 1910s, 1920s, 1970s, 1980s. And it's not as though there have been no bombings. I mean, people might not even remember that the Chaz, the occupied zone in 2020, featured the bombing of a police station.
Yeah.
These sort of things just either we have a fantastic capacity to compartmentalize trauma and not confront it, or they do not get the attention that they objectively deserve, which is why I bring to bear gratuitous levels of evidence that we're experiencing something like a violent left-wing wave akin to the 1910s, 1920s, 1970s,
So
1980s.
you describe in the book the Wall Street bombing. It was like it's horrifying. I never heard of it. If you can describe it, and it seemed that that bombing is a break from the past, even in kind of escalating violence. I mean, and also could maybe let's set the stage a little bit. Kind of like let's back a little bit. So so we don't like, you're not accused because your book is not just I mean, it's about left-wing violence to try to restore some balance, but it is not at all overlooking right-wing balance. In fact, the last chapter is all about this, and you're very clear throughout the book that this is not a project of saying, oh, the left is worse than the right, and to say it's time we recognize both type of violence are just unacceptable. So until now, until recently, how would you describe the kind of right-wing violence that we had?
Well, first to your point, yeah, I say at the outset of this book that you cannot honestly evaluate the phenomenon of domestic political violence by looking at one side. Because if you study one side of them and you hear what they say, they will consistently say that they draw inspiration from attacks on their adversaries by their allies, or that they resolve to mete out retribution and vengeance against the people who they believe shot first, struck first. And that usually often includes the state, because both sides of this equation believe that the state is on the side of their adversaries. So yeah, it's a reciprocal phenomenon, and you'll never get your hands around it by just evaluating one side of it. Traditional right-wing violence, as we have understood it over the course of this century, and maybe a little bit earlier in the 1800s, late 19th century, the FBI has terms of art to describe the various actors within the universe of DVEs, domestic violent extremists. And within that universe, you have what was typically captured a lot of, but not all, right wing political violence, racial and ethnically motivated violence, sovereign citizen movement violence, militia type violence. We saw a lot of that in the 1980s and 1990s. And what's still with us today, I would say probably the best example of a very recent militia, sovereign citizen style, violent extremist right wing plot was the attempt to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. Now, there are some on the right who maintain that the whole thing was a setup and that the FBI was entrapped these individuals. That's not the story, or at least not the whole story. There was an informant within this organization who was not affiliated with the FBI who blew the whistle when they were beginning to plot attacks on law enforcement and amass a significant amount of weapons and perform training toward that end. So the sovereign citizen, militia, right-wing extremist violence, racially motivated violence typically captured the sort of violence that we saw from the right, whereas the alternative is, again, captures most but not all, is anarchistic violent extremism.
Yeah, so that's a
That's the
lot.
left-wing version.
Yeah.
And that has some, calling cards associated with it too. And typically in the past, you did not see much overlap in terms of the tactics that these two distinct groups engaged in, or distinct tendencies engaged in. That's changed. In my view, in my book, in the final chapter, I articulate some of the ways in which the right is beginning to mirror and mimic the left in very unnerving fashions, adopting a martyrology, for example, around Ashley Babbitt, contending that the January 6th riots were a false flag, that the state itself was the adversary in that conflict. The inversion of victim and victimizer, which is very typical among the thinking associated with left-wing extremism. The notion being that victims are themselves agents of systemic oppression, and those who are meting out violence are only acting in due observance of their own conditions, the conditions that have been imposed on them, and therefore they are themselves blameless and have no agency. Those sort of things grease the skids for, or at least give you a permission structure to engage in political violence yourself. So we're beginning to see, in my view, a convergence, or at least more right wingers beginning to look like AVEs themselves.
So that's the revolutionary side, the anarchic side that the left has always embraced. And I think kind of at its core, there's this idea that the system is broken and there's no redeeming it without a revolution effectively, right? This has been really kind of the purview of the left. And all these movements, like starting, like, I mean, you started in the 1910s with,
A little earlier, I guess. I mean, I
yeah,
touch on the narrative really begins in 1886 with the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Haymarket riots.
Mhm.
Yeah, like when I was growing up, I think I got a pretty
What was a
reasonably good.
right-wing violence
So the Haymarket riots,
that ignored the left-wing violence, right?
well, there was, I mean, people don't even remember that there was a bombing of police during the Haymarket riots. But the popular imagination, the popular reading of that history, beginning in 1886 with the Haymarket riots and ending with the 1920 Palmer raids, is that nothing really happened in the middle there. save for the fact that America descended into an anti-immigrant fervor. And beyond that, it was all just the state waging an unrestricted and unrestrained campaign against innocent labor activists and the poor IWW and what have you. And then you just compartmentalize a whole lot of things are just elide, a whole lot of events that happened in the interim. And the reason why the American public, for all the abuses of the Wilson administration and earlier, well, the public had every reason to be terrified of the excesses to which the labor movement was inclined. There was labor bombings consistently. And then with the rise of the anarchist movement around the Italian anarchists, the primary organizer of whom was Luigi Galliani, there was a brutal bombing campaign, a poisoning campaign, an assassination campaign
Yeah,
targeting the highest echelons of American government. I was familiar with the September 1920 Wall Street bombing, but of all the stories in that chapter, that was the only one that I was familiar with. And it was very cursory. It was like a punctuation mark at the beginning of the Roaring Twenties.
that's true. There's the poisoning at the at the dinner, like the state. It's not a state dinner, but it's like it's a lot of like
Chicago dignitaries, yeah.
yeah, dignitary, and these guys that put arsenic and basically he put too much, and so
Current and former governors
yeah,
of Illinois, mayors of Chicago, had clergy, really ranking clergy within the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was a primary target of the Italian anarchists. It would have been a decapitation strike on some of the highest echelons of industry and politics in this country had it succeeded. But as you said, the poisoner used too much arsenic. That and the application of an emetic made of mustard
so
saved everyone's
yeah,
lives, almost everyone's lives.
I mean, tell us who Galliani was, what his beef was with the country. What's up with all of these guys being Italians, by the way?
Yeah.
When I was reading it, I was like, I didn't know that Italians had so much angst and anger. And if you can also like tell us about the Wall Street bombing.
Sure. So Luigi Galliani was born to means, a reasonably wealthy family in Italy, attracted to socialistic and anarchistic politics. By the way, as a digression, the linguistic, it's sort of anachronistic, but the linguistic distinctions that we use to distinguish the anarchist from the socialist really benefits the modern progressive because they say, well, what does that have to do with us? We don't want anarchy. We don't want a smaller state or no state. We want a much more bigger state. And at the time, at the dawn of the 20th century, these distinctions were, important for ideological purposes. You can kind of imagine the smoky parlor in which they would debate whether the state could dissolve at the outset of the revolution or whether it would require the stewardship of a dictatorship of the proletariat before it dissolved. All that sort of,
Yeah. But all their solutions
solipsistic stuff.
are more government,
Yeah, right.
nonetheless. So
So Galliani was attracted to anarchistic politics. He migrated to the United States, agitated on behalf of labor causes, and was caught up a little bit himself in those labor disputes, fled to Canada, fled back into Vermont, started a journal, a radical journal, and began to mobilize Italian anarchists around violence as a remedy to the excesses of
why
the state. That's where
Italians?
he
What's up with those Italians?
so, and there are theories that abound. Mine is that they had every reason to fear, and there's lessons for us here, to fear that the state had no concern for their safety, for their family's safety, indeed turned a blind eye towards the lynching of Italians. And there was, a really pretty ugly culture abounding, in the United States at the time in which juries would acquit individuals who were accused of murdering Italians, among other minority groups, because they were righteous acts of vengeance against, a really, kind of swarthy minority group who couldn't be trusted and was dominating the national imagination at the time. Again, Americans had reason to fear the labor movement, even if their fear resulted in a lot of injustices and excesses. So one of the expressions of that anxiety among Italians was to retreat into an insular, more tribal social compact. One of those expressions was the Italian mob. Another was anarchism and the Italian anarchist movement. And it was one of the bloodiest terrorist campaigns this country had experienced, even today, the degree to which the bloodshed that the Italian anarchist movement was responsible for, including things like the Preparedness Day bombing in San Francisco in 1916, the two attempts on the life of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, including one that almost assassinated a very young Navy Secretary, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. all these people were caught up in this
And
extremely
that
violent
with this
spasm.
one, this is the one where the guy who was delivering the bomb doing
Yes.
pop up. Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Who was atomized. To say
Mhm.
nothing of the Gimbels brothers package bombs, which was again another attempted decapitation strike on the highest echelons of American industry and politics. And it's shocking that this is forgotten today, but it is very much forgotten. Not at court. Don't trust me. Trust the scholars who have very recently begun to dig up the record here. And by recently, I mean pretty much this century,
Yeah.
because this work had
Yeah.
begun to be done at the turn of the
Mhm.
21st century. But when we're talking about 125 years ago, 100 years ago, I mean, I think that's qualifies as recent.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So the Wall Street bombing
Ah,
was a
yes.
turning point in the means used for violence, right? It was
Yeah, that
shocking.
was
I was shocked. I was shocked reading it. It was
because it was so indiscriminate.
yeah.
It really made the point that the anarchists had continually attempted to make in their literature. There are no innocents. And to that point, you could say, well, yeah, they say that, but what they do is target, political officials, clergy, and industrialists. So they really do have some targets in mind, and they're not indiscriminate killers. Not in this case. In the Wall Street bombing case, the targets was indiscriminate because it was right outside the stock exchange, and the victims were couriers and clerks and just people perambulating down the street, many of whom were killed by the falling glass from this extremely large explosive device that shattered windows blocks away. And that really turned the tide of opinion against the anarchist mob. But it also it was the culmination of efforts to roll up these terrorist organizations, indeed, roll up every group that the Wilson administration regarded as radical and anarchistic. And their primary focus was on the Bolsheviks and the nascent Soviet threat. But the application of the tools that were in law enforcement's toolbox and the withdrawal of the kind of tacit, not support for, but dismissal of the threat posed by Italian anarchism led to the dissolution of that phenomenon. It wasn't like a moment where they all went their separate ways, but the gradually through attrition abandoned the movement. Its key terrorists, including Luigi Gaiani, went back to Italy, many of whom lived out the remainder of their lives in anonymity. But yeah, that was the anarchist wave, and then it subsided briefly, but then it exploded with the vengeance at the end of the 1960s.
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, I mean, the 70s, like, it's um, like over 2,000 domestic bombing, like in a short period of time. I mean, mostly from left-wing groups. I just kind of, I mean, I knew about the Weather Underground, and in part because actually Eli Laird did a podcast on it recently somewhere. I can't remember where, but why has that history been so thoroughly scrubbed? And, from why isn't it part more of the things that we know to the point that actually I do think that generally people believe that the only source of political violence is right wing. In fact, I mean, President Biden said that, right?
Yeah, he did, and his administration made that point. Carefully, his FBI director, Chris Wray, did not make that point, even though words are often put in his mouth. For example, during testimony before Congress, and this is Joe Biden has said this himself, it is alleged that the FBI director maintained that Antifa is essentially a myth, that it doesn't really exist. Joe Biden himself put those words in Chris Wray's mouth. That is not what Chris Wray said. Chris Wray said that this phenomenon is an organizing principle that is simply in the ether. It is therefore harder to police. Not that it doesn't exist, but that it doesn't have an org chart. It doesn't have a financial structure. Its leadership can't be infiltrated. Its finances can't be frozen. It is an organic phenomenon, which makes it worse, which makes it even more scary. Your initial question, though, why is it that this stuff is consigned to the mystic chords of memory? I don't know. It would require me to assign motives to individuals who I don't know and who I couldn't possibly comprehend where they're coming from. But there does seem to be a conspiracy of shared interests, by which I mean not some sort of a secret plot that's hammered out behind closed doors, but a set of incentives that align to convince those in academic culture and in mainstream media and in commercial media and just generally in the public as well to de-emphasize the degree of trauma that was associated with these campaigns. I mean, even the people who lived through them are shocked to hear about the extent of the bombings and the violence and the shootings that went on during their lifetime. As you said, sometimes there were hundreds of bombings per week in the early 1970s, 71, 72, 73. This was such a regular phenomenon that law enforcement all but threw up their hands during the campaign of the FALN, Puerto Rican terrorists, some of whom were agitated by virtue of the machinations of the KGB in Moscow. And actually, the Puerto Rican nationalist movement goes back to the 1950s. Again, talk about some more forgotten violence. Harry Truman was almost assassinated by one. Congress was shot up by others in 1954. You can still see the bullets where they impacted in the House chambers. But in the FALN was executing its campaign of terror, one of the bloodiest of this period. And law enforcement said this is probably just going to go on forever, like quote unquote, because there's no way for us to get our hands around it. That was not true. It proved not to be true. That law enforcement did have the tools at its disposal and needed to apply them more rigorously. And when they did so, the phenomenon was rolled up very gradually. People remember the 1960s as being a particularly violent era, and what they mean is the late 1960s. But this violence really peaked in the early 1970s and proceeded throughout the early 1980s. It had a long tail on it. So, and all of these organizations were very attracted to Cuban style communism. They were at arm's length from the Soviets, but Cuban style Foucaultism was the really attractive idea for them. Foucaultism being part of this theory advanced by Regis Debray, who sort of retrofitted the very unique conditions that the Cuban Revolution occurred under, and it tried to universalize them and apply some operational language to them, as though the Cuban Revolution could be reproduced everywhere. It couldn't be. They tried. But what's very attractive about Foucaultism is it concedes that the revolution is not a majority proposition. It is the proposition of a very small band of committed, ideologically committed revolutionary guerrillas, a vanguard, and that small group can beget a massive societal change and bring down a government. You can see that as being a very attractive idea if you look around you and you see 7 of you. That's the sort of thing that, yeah, you would say, okay, well, Cuban style Foucaultism is for us. But these, there were a small number of individuals responsible for this incredibly broad and impactful campaign of violence. And once law enforcement applied itself to this, as well as society withdrawing its toleration for it, again, very much like the 1910s and 1920s, the phenomenon began to dissipate and eventually disappear. It was, however, replaced by more right-wing violence than we're comfortable with discussing as well. I'm often confronted by my right-leaning allies and friends and family members who say, "Well, what happened to everything was so placid in the 80s and 90s, and then it sort of devolved in the 2000s. What happened?" And my very unsatisfying answer for them is that the left does not remember the 1980s and 1980s as a particularly peaceful time in American history, if there ever was such a thing. There were tons of abortion bombings in the 1980s. One of whom was conducted by the individual who bombed the 1996 Olympics. There was sovereign citizen movement violence and militia violence. And that beget more militia violence. Waco was the inspiration for Tim McVeigh. It wasn't Rush Limbaugh, as Bill Clinton attempted very cravenly to contend. It was the Turner Diaries, and it was the federal response to Waco. So all these things are interconnected. All of them overlap. And I fully expect that this present wave of violence that we're experiencing from the left, which I think I've established in that book, will be followed by right-wing violence, because these two phenomena are reciprocal. They feed on one another. And unless we get your hands around one, then the other is bound to follow.
When I was reading your book, I was trying to like really figure out like what is it that get people to justify in their own heads this violence that exists. That's one question. But the other one is also kind of the worshiping violent people. Galliani had a worship, I mean, had a following. Like, I mean, like they were like, people like now he's forgotten. But I think about Che Guevara, right? I always feel like it's probably a sign about how old I am that when I see a kid with a Che Guevara t-shirt, I want to go and lecture that kid. Or like, like things are like people are called Mao kitchen. I'm always like, this is kind of weird.
You should. It'd
Why
be like wearing a Julius Streicher t-shirt.
I mean, it's like, or I mean, it's so weird. I mean, Reason had a really great video like 15 years ago about Killer Chic, where they were showing like all like, model Giselle like with a Che Guevara bathing suits and stuff. And you could not imagine this. You couldn't have Hitler's kitchen, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you and you shouldn't, but it's just so bizarre. And I try to kind of understand why are people like worshiping Luigi Mangione, the killer of Brian Thompson,
Even
and
retroactively, if you can apply, and the activists often do, you can fit these people who are guilty of acts of violence, often very parochial and self-interested violence, and you can locate them within the continuum of revolutionary thought to which the left is beholden. Then all of a sudden their actions are justified, their sins are washed away, and they ascend to this pantheon of heroes and martyrs that the left maintains. I'm thinking specifically of Mumia Abu-Jamal, who shot a cop and shot a cop because he was assaulting his brother, in his estimation. And there's an impossible amount of counter information around this case. As I write in the book, if you wanted to find out what happened to Officer Daniel Faulkner, who's the man who Abu Mumia Jamal killed, you have to search out what happened to him. If you search Abu Mumia Jamal, it is the endeavor of a lifetime to sift through all the misinformation and all the efforts to pull on threads that go nowhere and establish the guy's innocence, not by virtue of one very key fact, but dozens and dozens and dozens of them, all of which are of dubious utility. The fact is that he, after the fact, after his murder, retroactively associated himself with the Black Panther movement, with which he had had some tangential affiliation when he was a free man. And that is what conferred the kind of revolutionary legitimacy on him, as well as people like Assata Shakur and Leonard Peltier, the former just having been pardoned by Joe Biden. But their innocence is attested by some. But also, sometimes the very same people will say that whatever violence they were accused of doing was righteous and noble and fully justified in a way in like self-defense because of the excesses of the state. That's one. The second thing that you asked is what are they thinking, those who support this kind of violence? Well, something to which the Italian anarchists were beholden was a phenomenon called propaganda of the deed. And it more or less corresponds with what today's left-wing activists, violent left-wing activists, refer to as direct action. And what that is essentially violence. It's just really, polysyllabic jargon to describe acts of violence against state targets or targets seen to be as affiliated with the state, usually property, not often, or not always, but usually. And the notion here being it's disordered thinking. But the notion being that if you can mete out one act of spectacular violence, it will galvanize a broader audience. If you can demonstrate that the god bleeds, then the American people, cowed and passive though they may be, will have license to rise up against their oppressors as they so desperately want to, but lack the permission to do so, and this violence will grant it. And they will gravitate towards us, and we will engineer the revolution that we always want. That's one element of this phenomenon.
isn't
This
sorry, sir, go ahead.
No, just briefly, a second delusion to which the people I'm describing are beholden is that systemic oppression licenses extra-legal violence. However they define it, however subjective that may be, so if you're a victim of systemic oppression as they see it, then violence isn't just prescribed, but understandable, maybe even best practice.
Yeah, like isn't I was reacting to the first point and then the second actually, the three ladies at the outside of Luigi Mangione trial who were there, it seems to me, in part to shock and elevate their brands, but made some really kind of crazy comments about uh, ghoulish, yeah, about how you're murdering Brian Thompson was justified, like, it seems to be really actually, like, exactly echoing those 2 points that you just made,
Yeah.
right?
They called Brian Thompson a terrorist. They said that his children will be better off without them. Without him, they should enjoy the blood money that he has bequeathed them in the afterlife. And as Lena Weisbrot, I believe her name is, articulated, just as I said, she said the American people are as passive a population as there has ever been, and there would have been a revolution in any other society beset by these kind of systemic forces in which we have health insurance, which engages in mass murder, in her estimation. So we have metaphorical violence. I mean, even if I think if you shot them full of sodium pentothal, they'd say, well, we're really talking about the metaphor of violence here, even though it's taken to a very literal dimension. But then they prescribe real violence as the remedy to their metaphorical violence, which suggests that what they were really interested the whole time was violence.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a type of personality that very much describes. It's not my book, but I think a great companion to my book, because my book is focused entirely on the United States, and anything that takes place basically within the borders of the United States. Jason Burke, his latest book, The Revolutionists, describes everything that takes
You
place.
reviewed it in Commentary Magazine, if I remember.
Yes, I did. And he describes everything that takes place outside the United States. And he describes the evolution of a particular type of Marxian, a violent guerrilla Marxist who was very infatuated with the Cuban Revolution. He moved over to become ensorcelled with pan Arabism, socialist pan Arabism, akin to the Ba'athist regimes in Iraq and Syria, and then just goes full on Islamist after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the key thread there is that they really like violence, but violence against the right people who they perceive to be members of the elite, ruling class, particularly the capitalist class. Anybody who engages in the rapacious capitalist enterprise is target for that kind of retribution. So there is just a personality that likes to shock, likes to offend, very childish impulse, but it's nevertheless common. And you can make too much out of it because we see a lot of that in young people all the time. So you can overestimate, just how much of a menace that sort of shock your elders tendency happens to be. But when it corresponds with an outbreak of observable political violence in service to an ideological cause, pretty consistent service to an ideological cause, we should withdraw the toleration that we have for that sort of thing. Even if it's a youthful expression, it's very unhealthy.
But it's like it's kind of violence against the right type of people, but then it spreads, right? Because then it's like if you're silent and not joining in, the violence can turn against you, and then the violence becomes the regime. I mean, we've seen this other places. So it's just in your last chapter, like you mentioned it, you talk about the contagion to the right of these type of behavior. And my question is like, first, does violence ever pay off? I mean, outside of to elevate someone's brand and profile, does it actually ever achieves the goal that you pretend to be pursuing?
I think some very cynical people, particularly those who are opposed to political violence, nobly so, committed opponents of political violence who perceive their adversaries to be more violent than themselves, will say, yeah, it does beget the sort of changes that they want to see. And we are beset by these forces. And maybe we have to answer in kind. There's kind of a self radicalizing belief that I encounter all the time. People who convince themselves that violence from their adversaries especially has a measurable effect on society, and it's measurable insofar as it advances their interests and detracts from my own. And I don't think that's true. I genuinely struggle to see lasting ramifications from campaigns of political violence that redound to the benefit of the violent. I struggle to find it. I see a lot of indications that these things backfire, although it takes quite some time for that to materialize on occasion, in part because violence is terrorizing. It has the intended effect. If you're, back to that document for the Department of Homeland Security that I discussed, if you're altering your behavior for fear of physical retribution, you are effectively terrorized, which renders this a campaign of terrorism in the colloquial sense, at least, even though domestic terrorism is not really a legal category. It's certainly a rhetorical category, and it seems to fit within the pattern that we're experiencing now. Lawmakers, members of people on courts, are self-reporting the extent to which civil servants are self-reporting the extent to which they are bombarded with threats, and those threats are coming at them in an environment that is rapidly deteriorating. The threat environment is deteriorating. It's obvious that there is a real manifestation of this kind of violent sentiments. It's not just limited to online. It can spill out into the real world, and it's altering their behavior, indeed, even altering votes, according to some of the reporting that I quote in this book. So those are all that's a real phenomenon that results from a campaign of terrorism. Now, is that having a lasting impact on our civilization? No, I think we could really overstate that case, save for the effect that it should have, which I anticipate, which is the withdrawal of toleration for this sort of thing, which typically follows an outbreak of violence once it's reached its sell-by date, and the application of all the tools that are in law enforcement's toolbox to roll these forces up. And the Trump administration has just begun to engage in that project, to a significant amount of resistance from places like the New York Times, which maintained in April, I believe, that in the effort to discredit the Trump administration's legal efforts to roll up domestic violent extremist organizations in the United States on the left, and also expose the extent to which there are links, operational or otherwise, to other violent left-wing activist movements in Europe. The Times headline was, or the Times body of the reporting was, that the Trump administration had not presented any evidence that these groups represented a dire threat to the United States or the American people. That word is doing a Herculean lift by just,
Yeah.
we're amending the nature of the threat so that we kind of tacitly acknowledge that the threat exists, but you're making just far too much out of it. That's subjective. That's
Yeah.
not reporting.
Yeah. No, when would you say the third wave of violence started?
So I locate it in Seattle in 1999 with the
Hmm.
WTO
Yeah, with the
riots.
WTO react. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the leading indicator of what would become a campaign of left-wing violence. There were events throughout the aughts around opposition to the Iraq War, which is forgotten, around global trade, which is also forgotten, and generally around hostility to racism, a sort of a nascent anti-racist philosophy. Again, we're talking about violence from the left. Um, but the broader reaction from polite society to the WTO riots was one of horror and revulsion, including Democrats. They were not tolerant of what they saw and sought to stigmatize it. We're a far cry from that. When the Occupy Wall Street movement erupted, it was obviously a latently violent movement. All you had to do was listen to what these people were saying. Listen to what they were saying about Democrats. You asked them how much use they had for a Democratic politician. They'd say none. Throw them into the Hudson River. We don't need them.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the Democratic Party feted this organization. This organization is being charitable, this tendency, I'll call it. They lauded it. They said its goals were noble, its methods were just. Barack Obama said that, the people who were calling them anarchists, they called MLK an anarchist too. They were attempting to build it up in order to co-opt and redirect its energies in more productive ways and render it another element of the Democratic constituency. And they needed it at the time, having been on the receiving end of the or truly organic populist movement, the Tea Party's wrath.
Could they have
And
been also, could it have been kind of a way to kind of try to turn their anger away from them? So it's a way to say, to try to co-opt them and say, look, we're friends
yeah,
we're with
sure,
you. Just to
sure, could
put your
be
attention somewhere else.
two sides of the same coin, though, right? The
Yeah, yeah,
practical
yeah.
effect is to take ownership of these people who were violent people. Not only did they shield their members from law enforcement who engaged in theft and property destruction and rape, and shielded them from law enforcement. They went out and they invaded federal spaces, museums. Hundreds of them laid siege to the port in Oakland, where there was an actual firefight in order to just subdue this mob. Anytime they rolled up these encampments, police encountered violence as a result. And it reflected rather poorly on the Democratic Party. Not that they learned a single lesson, because in 2020, the very same phenomenon happened again. mass movements out in the streets. There's something about people power to which populist movements are very attracted. Big crowds, they see that as being an instrument of utility that they could harness and wield if only they had the right rhetorical tools. One of the objectives of this book, if I'm successful, is would be to convince civically minded people across the political spectrum that anyone who's engaged in violence or even advocating violence is not on your side, even if they hate all the people you hate, and if all the people you hate them. You
Yeah.
have different goals and different objectives, and neither of you you're working at cross purposes if you actually evaluate what they're trying to do. But
What
yes, Democrats fell
it
in love
taints
again with the 2020 mobs. They do it over and over and over
and it
again and
taints
refuse to see
your
the
yeah,
blemishes of these
yeah,
movements.
it taints your message, but it's also again, like, it it inevitably it turns it turns against you. Like French Revolution didn't end up well for Robespierre, right? I mean, it's just like anyone who partakes in violence is never sure that at some point they're not going to be basically on the receiving end of the violence themselves. And it is, I just think it's like you never, especially when they're like big crowds, right? When it's big crowds, you never know who's going to get caught in the crosshair. It's just like, I just don't understand why there's not a kind of bipartisan kind of condemnation of any type of violence without a but. Period. I mean,
Yeah.
when I don't know you, but when my kids were growing up, if their response to their sister to one, my sister bought me and you punched her in the face, it was not, I was in like great job, even though,
Because
I
yeah.
I was kind of like, it's like if you don't respond to violence with violence, even though I know that in some cases, why not? But it's just kind of like, you get what I'm saying. And it's just like I just don't get it. So now I want to ask you a last kind of question, like one before last. Where does anti-Semitism fits into all this?
So anti-Semitism is a significant feature of this current wave of left-wing violence. It was evident but sub rosa before the October 7th attacks. After the October 7th attacks, by which I mean October 8th, long before Israel mounted anything like a kinetic response to the worst single day massacre of Jews in the history of this planet since the Holocaust. There was there were demonstrations in the streets, activist movements who were engaged in menacing activity, which would very quickly evolve into attacks on property and even people. And there were some activists who I quote in this book who, within hours of this attack, did something that is very familiar to those of us who study the left's response to Israeli domestic security issues, which is that they lacquer onto the conditions that pertain to the Middle East, the American racial experience. So you heard people in the streets saying that the Hamas terrorists who murdered whole families, used rape as a weapon of war, etc. They were like American slaves, black chattel slavery,
Hmm.
rebelling against their masters. That analogy, that metaphor makes precisely zero sense within the context of the Israeli Palestinian conflict if you have a cursory familiarity with it. But it was just a really crude articulation of a thesis that was retailed by Ta-Nehisi Coates,
Hmm.
who spent a couple of days in the West Bank and came back and said, well, this is obviously Jim Crow. It's the sort of thing that passes for erudition on the American left, but ends up becoming a permission structure for something pretty ugly. And what we saw was incredibly ugly. Campuses and cities, whole cities, subsumed or consumed rather with violence directed towards Jewish businesses, visibly Jewish students, Israeli students. They were harassed, assaulted. Some were killed. Windows of Jewish businesses were shattered. Thoroughfares and bridges were blocked, blocking medical traffic. Some throwing up balloons in front of airplane tarmacs in order to disable airplanes and possibly even kill everybody on board. The Democratic National Committee was besieged by a violent mob that
Hmm.
attacked police officers. Members of the Democratic Party had to be rescued by police. Sean Casten, who's a Democratic representative from Illinois, told reporters that it could have been much worse had we not been saved. And all the while, you had elements within the Democratic Party, including Joe Biden, including Kamala Harris, including Tim Walz, trying to ingratiate themselves with this movement, which you have to understand has a point. Joe Biden would say constantly, Kamala Harris would say constantly, fetting them, allowing their delusions, evidentiarily challenged delusions about how the conflict was proceeding, to fester and metastasize and fuel narratives like the notion that Israel's engaged in genocide, like Israel's engaged in famine campaigns, uses rape as a weapon of war. And all because it is a neo-colonial outpost of white people in the brown global South. All of these narratives you've heard before if you study this subject, and you heard them in the 1970s when the Soviet Union retailed them.
Yeah,
And
it
there's
was striking.
documented evidence around this. This
It
was a
was one of
Soviet
the
project.
it's one of the things that I found just really striking about the book is like kind of how this is a kind of a there's a common thread. Like it's not just a common thread, it's just there's a mindset and there's just that there emerges and it expresses itself. And while kind of the details around may be different, ultimately it is the same narrative that you
Same narrative
hear
and the same
over.
people and reincarnations of the
Yeah.
same of the
It's just like
same kind of
it's
figure.
really quite fascinating. But so like the question now is the last chapter of the book talks about how the right is adopting these. So we are in the midst of a lot of like left wing violence, and the right is going to retaliate. Do you fear? So what do you think this looks like? And and it seems because you start with Trump, it seems that well, I thought it was kind of interesting, like how Rubio is like, you can't say everything you want to say. There's still things that you can't. There's right and wrong. Right things you can say to people. Bad things you can behave. Cannot just kind of decide to just like attack everyone. And you just like he's trying to kind of make the case that there's like way of behaving. And meanwhile, you have Trump who actually seems to have broken literally all the norms, and now the right is mimicking him. Does he alone bear a lot of kind of the responsibility for the shift in the right? I mean, it's not him alone, but like, would you pinpoint the shift in the right to basically the emergence
I
of
don't know.
Trump?
It's possibly more epiphenomenal, a result of the rise of populist politics on the right.
Yeah,
Um, I am deeply skeptical of populist politics broadly, and one of the reasons being that it has that real affinity for people power that I find so misguided. If you see big movements in the streets, you don't see that as threat or hazard or something to be handled cautiously. You see it as an opportunity. It's something to be captured as fast as you possibly can in the most graceless manner imaginable, because someone's going to come behind you and do it worse than you did. You have to take advantage of this moment while you have it. And I started chronicling, political violence with a high degree of apprehension at the in 2015, 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump. Donald Trump gave, in my view, very irresponsible rhetorical support to individuals who would respond to his protesters with
yeah,
violence. He'd say at his rallies, "Throw the guy out, strip his coat. I hope you hit him in the back of the head. I'll pay your legal fees," which he
yeah,
never did.
yeah.
Even and there was, and people heard his calls for violence and acted. And it was something that was treated with the severity that it deserved. It was treated very solemnly
Except
and
by voters, I guess.
by the press, by the Republican Party, by his opponents in the Republican Party. In March of 2016, political violence from the right, encouraged by Donald Trump, was something that every aspect of society responded to, in my view, responsibly, with the exception of Donald Trump and his core committed supporters. They were very unnerved by it. What didn't get anything like the level of attention that it deserved was the violence that was being meted out against Trump supporters.
Yeah,
Trump supporters were attacked at rallies. They were beaten bloody. They'd have the clothes torn off their backs. Police officers would be assaulted, hit over the head with bottles. Rallies would be closed, including in places like Chicago, Illinois, not some small place.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
The whole rallies would be shut down at outside convention centers. And this phenomenon only increased over the course of the Trump administration, where there would be plenty of violence on the right. And I don't shy away from it. I try to include as many examples as I can.
I had forgotten a lot of that stuff actually. Even like the way it's like it's very hard to get a kind of a retell of what happened in Charlottesville that is not completely polarized and partisan, and yours is actually kind of reminds like remind people like all of it, and it's really useful.
Thank you, because I'm actually revulsed by political violence. Like, this isn't an act.
Yeah.
Like, I find it 100% horrifying. But yeah, there was affinity groups. That's something that's typically associated with the left, right? But right-wing elements who were associated with the guy who executed the vehicular assault that killed Heather Heyer were engaged in what's called affinity groups, attracted to affinity groups, was a formerly left-wing thing that has become embraced by some of these very populistic elements on the right, whose real only attachment to the right is the extent to which it offends the right people, shocks the right people. They don't have really right-wing political sensibilities or policy preferences. They're generally inclined towards disruption and the prospect of a reversal of social fortunes at the top from which they believe they will benefit. What would you call that besides a revolution? They are, again, two sides of the same coin, attached to revolutionary disorder from which they believe they will benefit, and that disorder is ignited by the application of violence. Selective, perhaps, but certainly big enough to galvanize an audience.
Yeah, and then January 6th obviously is another,
Yeah, the sum of all Madisonian fears. I'm sincere. I'm tragically sincere about how awful January 6th was, and the retroactive conditioning that's been applied to the right about what that was and what it meant is one of the greater tragedies of this decade.
yeah, yeah. And it's kind of interesting, and this is like I've done my mea culpa many times. I don't have cable at my house, and so I didn't watch what was happening. And I would hear people talk about, it's an insurrection. I don't know, it's technically it's an insurrection, but talk about it in these terms that I thought, it's kind of the left talking about, and then it's about what happened, and I kind of like dismissed it for like honestly not that I didn't think something happened and that it was bad, but kind of I didn't I think it took me to actually watch Trump's speech and watch really kind of sit down and watch the images before I realized what that was, and kind of like I think start to be properly horrified. I'll admit, like where you're so used to talk about hearing people talk about right wing violence and figuring out later that it's not what it was, what we'd been told, that I was kind of, it's not that I didn't think it was bad. I just didn't measure like the scope and how just terribly terrifying it was.
And we're gonna get more of it. I mean, I watched it every minute of it as it happened like it was 9/11. It was, to me, one of the most sobering moments in my adult life because of how portentous it was, and those portents have been all but ignored. The president is very committed to rehabilitating his actions on that day and the actions of his supporters such as he sees them. And the blanket pardons were that, following exactly in Joe Biden's footsteps, reducing these individuals not as individuals with agency and specific charges, but as avatars of a tribe, and pardoning everybody, members of this tribe, some of whom didn't deserve to be pardoned, some of whom were very violent, some of whom have been recidivists in the interim, welcoming some of these people into the Justice Department. Jared Weiss is a valued member of the Justice Department, according to the DOJ, who was filmed on January 6th, hectoring police, calling them Gestapo, and saying, kill them, and calling them Nazis. And here you have Ed Martin, who is the head of the weaponization group, which is generally a euphemism, in my view, for rehabilitating January 6th and all its associated people who were associated with it, where he says the following. The more we find out about how staged and managed this was, he said of January 6th, the more we have to have less judgment on somebody who hits a cop. I've seen people hit a cop, and that doesn't make it the end of the world. This from a member of the Department of Justice in the Law and Order Administration. We're through the looking glass, and to a degree that will radicalize those who are inclined towards violence on the left and the right in ways that responsible stewards of civic comedy should be much more leery of and fearful of inviting.
So how do we get out of it?
So, so when you write a book, your publisher says, you're gonna have to have some recommendations for what you want to do here. And like, I don't have the answer to the problem of political violence in the United States. That's not, I would be selling you something if I said that, yeah, I got a panacea right here for you. I have some recommendations, which I think on the margins could, help out with the problem. But the problem of political violence in this country is going to be with us forever. However, the New Lines Institute has some specific recommendations about sort of the rhetorical language that law enforcement agencies, particularly at the local level, could use, which would help, not solve, but help disabuse those who are rational enough to reevaluate their priors, that law enforcement isn't necessarily on the side of your enemies, whoever that happens to be, in a low social trust environment, taking away those radicalizing factors is one valuable way to do this. Another is to recommit to civic education, in part to comprehend where politics begins and ends. We have politics knows no rational bounds anymore. This is mostly the focus of my second book, but politics isn't about legislation or elections or enumerated duties in a constitution. It's about the food you ate and the commercials you watch and the clothes you wear and the people you associate with and sex and drugs and where you live and all this other stuff that has no bearing on politics per se. It may be political and we may be politicizing it, but it's not politics, and it's because it's not responsive to political mechanisms, not in a country defined with a narrow constitutional remit defined by laws. We can also apply the tools that law enforcement already has on the books to proactively police these sort of things and recognize, who is liable to be an executor of political violence. Nora O'Donnell on CBS confronted the president with the ramblings of the madman who attempted to kill him, his third attempted
Yeah.
assassin.
Yeah.
And in part because I think she thought they were kind of banal, the stuff he believed in. He had written in his missives that the president was a pedophile and a traitor and a criminal and a rapist, and all that stuff is pretty part and parcel. It's currency, really, on forums like Blue Sky. I'm sure Nora O'Donnell encounters it on a semi-daily basis, and the reasonably well-educated, semi-erudite people who retail insanity like that. What's wrong with it? I encounter this sort of thing every day. Why don't you, Mr. President, respond to it? In an earlier age, his actions in attempt on the president's life would have discredited retroactively anything he had previously written, but not in this case, in part because I think she thinks the left, I don't know what she thinks, but the leftist myth is that people who engage in political violence, political terrorism, are themselves dispossessed, they are beset by privation and want. And that's just not the case. Sociologists, in the case of Islamist terrorists, some sociologists, I quote, identify the through line, a similar feature that's shared by a significant number of Islamist terrorists, and that's in engineering degree. It's not a crushing poverty. It is the extent to which they're relatively affluent, relatively well off, relatively educated. And it sort of makes sense
Well,
when you think,
Galliani, Luigi Mangione, all these guys, like, I mean, they're not coming out. They're not, they're usually, I mean, the Weather Underground guys
no, this is
were,
a learned
it,
trait. It is a
yeah, yeah,
learned behavior.
yeah, yeah. It's like they're educated and they're actually come from wealthy families, and it's really interesting. I think that kind of actually trying to open maybe the eyes people to the fact that maybe there's a blind spot that favors left-wing violence and try to kind of recalibrate. I'm hoping that your book actually will help, get us out
Me
of
too.
this.
I'm
And
hoping the New York Times attacks me. If they were smart, they would. They would say this book is nonsense because I'm laundering into the discourse a really principled argument for why January 6th and the associated traumas around it, before it and after, was a horrible event that presages really terrible things that Republicans should turn away from if they have any attachment to their political project at all. That this is bad for you, and it's the sort of thing that presumably, if you've agreed with me for the first 7 chapters, you get into that chapter and you see me hold this mirror up to you, and the unlovely reflection in it should let you, at least contemplate, if not endorse the recommendations in my book, contemplate the prospect that political violence, especially of the sort that looks a lot like left-wing political violence, which comes after you. It's not like sovereign citizen movement violence that is standing pat and waiting for law enforcement to descend on them. It's proactive, it's predatory. That's a sort of thing that is really unnerving, very terrifying. And Republicans and right-wingers and conservatives across the board, everybody I know, is deeply concerned about the deteriorating threat environment and the likelihood that it will involve them at some point. They should be. But they should also be concerned about the extent to which their behaviors or those of their compatriots are exacerbating the problem.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to end. Thank you very much, Noah. And good luck promoting your book.
Thank you, Vero. This has been a treat.
Thank you.